Okay, now we're getting ready to explain something that's really quite sophisticated. When she says to Abraham, even also his seed, until forever, that's where we're at. This is referencing, oh boy, how am I going to explain this? There is a balance. God uses time as a balance sheet. And she is tying to that balance sheet item, which Daniel was also referencing in his meter. But the meter and the balancing actually began with Moses. All right, in Psalm 90, which you're going to see here. Okay. You saw this when I began, I think it was Magnificat 3. I was explaining that Moses' time poem is divided into pretty evenly, even segments here, each of which represents a 1050. This is the last 1050 of history, okay, with the 14 pregnant inside that Mary's going to be using. The 7-year voting period represents the first 1050 of history, which is the Adamic period. And, here I explained the years that are involved. And then the second voting period of history follows 980 years afterwards, which is the period during which Noah voted, and that's how come we're all alive today. Okay, this is when Noah voted. And as a result, he also supermatured, and that's how come we're all alive. Then 980 years more follow. That's 2 490s. And then the next voting period was the one that Moses lived in, and it was his vote that caused the Exodus. Okay, and if you don't believe that it caused the Exodus, go look at Numbers 14 and its associated passage. I want to say in either Exodus or Deuteronomy, where God offers to wipe out all of Israel and just start over with Moses. So Israel is attributed to Moses. They were, just like us, rebellious that much at that time. But he wasn't rebellious. He voted. So that's why Israel got to live. That's why we get to live. Okay? And then the future of Moses period that was going to be in jeopardy, that's why it's represented by a 56, was the period that we call associated with Purim, which is really 467 BC after Purim happened, down to 397 BC when the last book of the Old Testament was written, Malachi, which presaged John the Baptist and the advent of Christ. And if you read the book of Malachi, you'll find out that God says to the priests 200 years before Hanukkah, you guys are so corrupt. I'm not going to talk to you anymore. You're not teaching my law properly. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to shut up now. Here's the last book. And, Malachi 4 verses 5 and 6. I'm going to send you the herald of Messiah. That'll be the next time you hear from me. So everybody claiming to speak for God between 397 BC and the advent of John the Baptist, everybody claiming to speak for God, here's another book of the Bible, they're all liars. That includes and stresses, in fact, the Maccabees. They were liars. They started out good like so many people do. We all do like that. And then the power went to their head. And they usurped the houses of Aaron, who were entitled to be high priests. And they usurped the Davidic line, entitled to be king. So, that's why Book of Malachi was written. So, that's why Moses, presaging it, has this equal to 56 rather than 70, and puts the other 14 up here, which Mary is referencing. Now, we have to talk about our boy Abraham, and that's where it's going to be a little bit complicated. I've introduced this to you already, so you shouldn't be too surprised. Okay? Abraham, here he is. Abraham. Noah, as we saw, here's the voting period for Noah. This is the voting period that was in verses 9 through 11 of Psalm 90. Okay? Verses 8 through 5 through 8 of Psalm 90 are right here. It doesn't show much because I didn't list any historical events. That was the period when Adam and his sons voted. Alright? Next time was Noah, and that's bigger because I have so much to say about it. Okay, that's when he votes and gets his covenant. And his covenant meant a 490-year time grant that expires right here, 2046 from Adam's fall. Not from creation, from Adam's fall, Genesis 3:22. Okay, well, the first 2100 years, and which the Jews today call the Age of Desolation, and they think it's only 2,000 years, because they've forgotten how to count. That 2100 years wasn't up yet, but Abraham had to super mature by 2046 after Adam, because that's when Noah's personal 490 time grant ran out. It's the earlier of. History was supposed to end if Abraham didn't mature. So this isn't technically speaking a voting period, but it is the last 54 years of history for the 2100 years owing to pre-Israel. There was a promise that this time would go on if somebody would super mature every 490 years. As far as I can tell, those are terms of the angelic trial. Okay, I can't find any other reason why it's 490. 490 is 77s, or 770s, okay? So, Abraham super matured, age 100. We all know the story, and yet we don't know the story. He matured 54 years in advance of the ending of the time for the Gentiles. 54 years early. All my Psalm 90, my whole Psalm 90 playlist focuses on this at the beginning and the ending. The cute videos with the music, okay, to introduce the topic, they all center on this. Israel knew that there was a 54-year credit owing to the Gentiles, and in the Mosaic Law that was memorialized by Jubilee, 50 years. See, last 50 years. Last 50 years was supposed to be a voting period for the Goyim of history. That's what Jubilee represents. And Pentecost, harvesting the Gentiles. That's what Jews think of it today. That's the nickname for Pentecost. Represents the period of harvesting the Gentiles, which is the last 50 years of history. Well, the last 50 years of history, and every 1,000 years there's an extra 50 appended. So that's 49 plus 70, 490 plus 70 plus 490 equals 1050 equals 1,000 plus 50. That's how time is designed by God. Okay? So Abraham's mature a little too early. So how are the Gentiles going to get paid back that on Jewish time? Because Jewish time had its own 2,100 years, which is all going on here that you're seeing roll on screen. Okay? This is when Jewish time was supposed to end. Okay, well, see, the last 50 years begin here, end here. 7 years before that, it's now 7 years, not 54, because that was the deadline of David's own death. 1,000 years after David died, that was when the tribulation was supposed to begin. So it's not a 54-year credit anymore, it's now 57. Why? Because David died late. Or, you can argue, I haven't worked this out 100% yet, or because the temple started late. The temple didn't start construction until 3 years after David died. That's 1 Kings 6:1. And the 3 years after David died are covered in 1 Kings 2, starting at verse 39, all the way to the end of 1 Kings 5, explaining the lapse. Because 2 Samuel 7, after David dies, the temple should have started. That was the promise by God to David. But Solomon dragged his feet, probably because he was in civil war, as illustrated by 1 Kings 2:39, when Shimei had to be executed because he was starting up trouble. So in the 4th year of Solomon's solo, 1 Kings 8:1, 480 years after the Exodus, when David would have been 80 years old, you'd know that if you'd have done your math. Josephus didn't do his math, so Josephus thought David was 70 when he died. But according to the Bible, which is absolutely much more authoritative than Josephus, when David would have been 80 years old, the temple started. That's a 3-year delay. That accounts for this being 7 years instead of 3. There are other reasons for it, but that's the root. That starts before Israel lost her sabbatical years and all that. There was already this problem. Israel could have made it up in other ways, but she didn't. So we got 7 years from there to there, and 50 years from there to there. But 54 of them, 54 of what became 57 years, are owing to the fact that our boy Abraham matured 54 years early. So 54 of the 57 years, really 53 and a half, are owed to the Gentiles. And the remaining 53 and a half, 3 and a half, owing to the lateness of the temple construction, probably. Okay, that's the most probable reason for it. That is called the Great Tribulation in the Bible. That belongs to the Jews. And that's the last half of the tribulation. It's a time debit. Church doesn't get any part of that. That's why the rapture is pre-trib. It's a math thing. It's a balancing the books thing. It's balancing time for this time that's owed from Abraham and the other loss of time due to the lateness of starting the temple under the Jews. Okay? It's time balance. Time must balance. Time must do what God wants it to do. That's Isaiah 55. Give us as many good days as you gave us bad days. That's Psalm 90, verse 15. Oh, please, computer, don't die on me now. Right in here. This is Moses' own vote. Verse 15, Moses prayed, give us as many good days as you gave us bad days. You can read it in any translation you like. All right? So, that's what God does. And Moses, of course, prayed it because he already knew this whole rule about God balancing time. So he's invoking what God's own policy is. Okay? Balance the time like you promised you would. You gotta, you might know God's opinion or God's rule, but if you don't vote for it, you don't get the benefit from it. Moses is voting for it. I have to remember that every day. I forget to, you got to pray for yourself as well as praying for everybody else. And if you don't vote to get rid of the terrorists, and you don't vote to end hunger, and you don't vote for good leaders, you ain't going to get them. You don't vote for good pastors, you're not going to get them. God wants you to vote for all that stuff. God votes for it. Okay, that's 35. But to make it 70, you got to vote too. It's not that God needs your opinion. He won't do a thing that you don't ask for. So ask. Be like Jabez. Ask for everything. That's what I do. And he'll give you what's really good for you. But make sure you ask for everything because you don't know. Maybe it is good for you. Maybe it's good for you to have $1 million. I kind of doubt it. It's not very much fun to have money, I got to tell you. But maybe it's right for you. Maybe your soul needs that training. Okay, fine. Ask for it. See, Moses did. He asked for time. That's even more valuable than money. Give us as much good time as you gave us bad time. Okay, give me as much good money as you gave me debt. Moses asked for it, so we should too. End commercial message on that. Now back to Mary. So, when she's talking about, Daniel uses the same clever wording. When she talks about to Abraham, even also to his seed, until forever, that's taking up 15 syllables. Now watch the math here. We saw in the prior increment that Christ is going to die in the beginning of, it's real important, in the beginning of his 40th year, which is at the beginning of the 201st year of the temple since Hanukkah. Beginning. That's the same thing as saying the end of the prior year. All right? Because he's going to be 40 and 3 months old by the time he's what? Pros. Face to face with what? The fathers, namely the Father and all the other fathers who died before him. He'll be dead. At this point, the way the doctrine was working in those days, they were in paradise under the earth. He was going to go down there, tell everybody, hi, I wanted the cross. At age 40, that was the schedule. It ended up happening at age 33, but at age 40 it was the schedule. He was going to go down there, announce to everybody saved and fallen, hi, I wanted the cross, believe in me now. Because the people who are not believing in him that are in hell, they still need a chance to get out. And then when he resurrects, he takes them all with him. That's Ephesians 4, 8, and 9. So he's face to face with the fathers. That means dead. I mean, it's got the backwards meaning too. God alive in a theophany, testifies to the patriarchs. right? Not just the patriarchs, but everybody before her time. All the Jews before her time. Just as he testified, yep. And he's going to be testifying from where? From hell. Talking to who? The saved and the fallen, because everybody's located in Hades, under the earth, at that time. Paradise compartment, that's Luke 22, that Luke's going to also cover. See, all this presages what Luke's going to say. Not Luke 22, Luke 16. Victorious proclamation, my pastor called it. That's also in 1 Peter, I forget where, when Peter talks about it also, about him going down there. Okay, that's biblical. Hell is biblical. You don't like it? Too bad. I don't like it. Nobody likes it. God least of all. But this is what happened. And just as he testified, he dies at the beginning of his 41st year, which is age 40 and about 3 months. You got that? Age 40 and about 3 months. This is real important. Mary's going to make an adjustment for the fact that this is the beginning of the year. So instead of adding 14, which is what she's really meaning, she's going to add 15. All right? This is 11. That takes you to 212. This is 5. That takes you to 17. She's doing this somewhat artificially in order to make the time poem, because it's one of the rules of a time poem, this has to be divisible by 7 at the end. This threw me for a bit. So, look. He dies. That's an ending. At a beginning. You got that. He dies age 40. You're age 40 at the end of your 40th year. The day you turn age 40, you are beginning your 41st year. Got that? So she's not going to count 14 more years. She's going to count 15 because this is at the beginning of the year. So that's what she does. This is 15. But it has the effect of, if you're thinking, in terms of real math, age 40 plus 14 equals what? 54. And when you take this number, 217, and you subtract it from the initial Hanukkah, which is 164, you get what? 40. So you got 40 dead. See, age 40, he's dead. And this number means that there's 40 years left on the time clock to run until the second advent. This is where she's balancing to Daniel. All right? In between to Abraham, promised. See, to Abraham. She's referencing the extra 14 years that are pregnant in her, that are pregnant in Psalm 90. See how clever this is? We aren't this clever today. She's referencing those 14 years. Because why? Because the time that's owed is 54 years. 40 plus 14 is what? 54. You got that? Your head might be spinning, but try to wrap your head around that, because now when we go to Daniel, it's going to really be awesome. Okay, now we're getting into the tie between Mary and Daniel. Both of these documents will be in the video description. You can download them. Daniel's the most complicated of the time poems I've yet seen. And in order to understand what Mary's doing, we got to show them kind of both on screen at the same time. Took me, 2-3 hours now to lead up to this. Where we had left off in the last episode was we were down here, and I was explaining how this is the beginning of Christ's 41st year. And as you probably noticed, I kept calling this 15 instead of 16, because I was trying to explain that this is at the beginning of his 41st year. So you got to add an extra 1 in here for that. But even so, this sum is 16, not 15. This is a clever thing that is done with Hebrew meter, which causes the scholars no ends of problems, because they also do it with the calendar. The numbers that are explicit. When they're adjusting to a beginning of a year, and when they're also making a point about the next the transition between an old ruler and a new ruler, or the old time and the new time. They piggyback the new year on the old year. And there's been a lot of scholarly discussion about this, and the scholars come up with a sort of shorthand, inaccurate answer that in counting in general, that you're counting the beginning and the ending, as if that's all it was. All right, but that isn't all it was. When you're making a point about the transition, you're counting two things as complete wholes separately. Okay? This is a complete whole. He dies in what becomes his 41st year. It's another complete whole that the temple's own year is beginning at that time. It's another complete whole that there's 14 years old extra to Abraham, counting the 40 that's remaining when you take this into account. But when you take this into account, if you subtracted 164 BC, which was Hanukkah, from that, you got 41. Why? Because it's the beginning of a year. All right, that's, you can say, okay, well, that's what that is. In other words, it's counting one complete whole that's really starting on the same year as another complete whole. So it looks like you're counting the same year twice. And in a sense, you are. You're counting it one time for one complete whole and one time for a different complete whole. But Mary's doing more than that. All right? Because if you counted from here to here, you'll notice that this is 16 syllables, just by itself. See, this is done on purpose. He's 40 when he dies. And you can say, okay, well, it's the beginning of the new year. But leaving that out, just adding in a normal manner, you got 56 going on here. See, he's 40 when he dies. You'd have to know that schedule, which is not known in Christendom today. They don't realize that there was a different schedule pre-church for the Millennium, okay, because they don't listen to the Jews talk about the different ages. The Jews got it garbled. They say it's 2000, 2000, 2000. Okay, but the story, there is a version of that story in the Bible, which is 2100, 2100, 2100. All right? And that is what's being referenced here. So the problem was, as we saw in the last episode, Abraham matured 54 years early. So the second 2100 that starts for the Jews, which they call 2000, the age of Torah, is their current term for this period, that period. That started 54 years early for the Jews. So there's a 54-year time credit, which, like I said, was encoded in the Mosaic Law as Jubilee, and then by the time it got to the time of the Mosaic Law, and then by the time it got to when Messiah was going to arrive, which Daniel is going to be covering, it was 57 years, not 54 anymore. And that, like I said in the last episode, is probably due to the fact that Solomon waited, 3.5 years too long before starting the temple after David died. Okay? So Mary's taking that into account also. And this is how she specifically ties to Daniel, except where she ties to Daniel, Daniel's making the same adjustment for Abraham, as we're going to see. Okay? So you've got this whole thing here takes him to age 40 plus 16, which is 56. Do you remember that? 56? That was the last paragraph in Psalm 90, the shortened 14 years, the 14 years pregnant, the 14-year pregnancy of time. Okay, that was in Psalm 90, verses 16 and 17, and it was wryly worded, establish the work of our hands. What is the work of their hands? Okay, well, at the time, immediate to the prophecy Moses was giving in Psalm 90, verse 16 and 17, it was the voting period just after Purim, and the problem there was the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Would it stay rebuilt? It had been rebuilt, but it was in danger again. And the people who think that there is some human decree, whether in 457 or 444, sending Nehemiah back, those people can't read Bible. There is no human decree in Daniel 9. Daniel 9:24 is the decree of who? God. Said by who? Gabriel. Humanity, including us dispensationalists, have been tied up in knots over that phrasing. Why don't we look at who's saying the decree? It's God saying the decree. And where did he say the decree? In Jeremiah 25 and 29. 70 years this people. That's not 70 years Miss Sabbatical. It's 70 years this people. The number of Miss Sabbatical years were 49, which Daniel is going to cover. And we're going to see that briefly, because I've covered this already in the Psalm 90 videos. But that means that time is 14 years short. Nehemiah does go back in either 446 or 444 BC because the walls are down. That renders Jerusalem vulnerable, even though it had been rebuilt. Obviously, the temple was rebuilt in 516, Jerusalem with it. But it was threatened. Okay? So that's why the 56 is recorded by Moses in Psalm 90, verses 16 and 17. Establish the work of our hands. First work of the hands, rebuilding. But the ultimate work of the hands is for there to be hands. For there to be this person named Messiah who returns to exchange for Israel, his child. He's going to have hands. He has to be in his humanity to pay for sins. Deity doesn't owe anything for sins. His humanity didn't either. But it's man that sinned, and he's exchanging his human life for the human life of everybody. Now, obviously, if he's going to be able to do that, just like Isaiah 53:11 says, to do that, it's not going to be physical death that pays for sins. Physical death of one person cannot pay for everybody. That's not possible. God is not paid by you physically dying. And Isaiah 53:11 tells you how he paid. By his mastery of knowledge, he makes righteous. Badato yatzdik in Hebrew. My bad pronunciation of the Hebrew. He was alive on the cross, thinking while sins are imputed to him, Isaiah 53:9, 53:8, 53:7, 53:4, and 5, especially those two verses, 4 and 5. The sins are being hitting him. He was stabbed with our sins. That's what Isaiah 53:5 says. Macholal, that means to stab with a javelin. Okay, my pastor spent a lot of time exegeting that part of 53:5. He was stabbed. Okay, he has to be alive to counterthink when sins are hitting him. Those are all thinkings of us. All right, sin is always a thought. The body just follows along. All right, the sin thoughts are hitting him. The only way they can be paid for is by divine thought. And as a human being, he can have divine thought because he's also God-man. In other words, his soul had to be big enough. The only way it could get big enough is for him to have a soul full of Bible, which is divine thinking. And that's why he had to be God-man. So, because otherwise it'd kill him to have that high level of thinking. So he has to have a dual nature in order to stay alive. It's not that he used his deity. He has to be able to be big enough in his soul as a human being. And to do that, he's got to be both God and man. All right? The second reason he has to be God and man is that it has to be God-level thinking, God paying God. God-level paying God. But he's doing it through the humanity, which made it harder. He should have been killed just by the thought pattern that he had to have, the high value of the thought pattern. I mean, these are like billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of sins of all human history hitting him in only 3 hours. Hello? How come he didn't die? Because he's God-man. His soul could therefore be larger than a normal human soul could be. And because he's sinless, there's no break in the nature. And therefore he can think high enough to really pay for sins with counterthought. That's Isaiah 53:11. He didn't die physically for our sins. He didn't bleed to death. And puerile, childish, excuse the expression, Catholic Christianity has always taught that he physically died for your sins. It's not just the Catholics, though. I don't want to single them out. Because the Protestants are just as puerile in their idea of how sins got paid. Okay, and I cover that in my Genesis videos, showing that he paid for sins. I showed the text live on screen, because it relates to certain passages in Genesis I had to show. All right? It's also in the KJVOB playlist on Isaiah 53:11. So he returns to exchange his soul. Isaiah 53:10 is the deal. If you will exchange your soul as a substitute for sins. Im tasim hasham nafsho. In my Americanized Hebrew. Okay. That's Isaiah 53:10. If you will give your soul as a substitute for sins. Hasham is the Hasham offering, that red heifer, for the whole nation, whether they believe or not. That's what he was to do. That was age 40, he was supposed to die doing that. And then 14 more years takes care of the Abraham debit, but she's actually also going to 16 years in order to cover the 56. And that's what we now get to Daniel. Alright? As you see before you in the lower window, this is the first page of Daniel explaining the importance of meter in Daniel. Daniel's very complicated. More complicated than all the rest of them that I've seen so far. So now we're going to show you where this 56 is coming from. Okay. The 56 is coming in many places. The first place it shows up is in Daniel's meter when he closes. Oh, this is so complicated to explain. The first place it shows up is as a cumulative number in Daniel 9:13. Do you remember the expression 62 weeks in God's reply in Daniel 9:25-26? This is where it comes from. Is God is replying to Daniel's meter that you can't see in English. So you don't know why the 62 weeks is there. Alright? He's replying to Daniel's meter. Daniel is doing a line-by-line accounting of the kings from David forward. Alright? And by the time he gets to verse 13, he's gone full circle. He's operating on 2 time tracks. It's very complicated. He's starting out at the moment he prays, which is very early in 538 BC. Okay, somewhere between November 539 and April 538. And he's using 49 syllables to introduce himself to God. You know, not that God doesn't know who he is, but it's his opening prayer. He's dating 49 years from Temple down. That's how many sabbatical years were missed. He's at the beginning of the 49th year because he knows it's going to take time to start returning people to the land. It's just after Cyrus has taken over. The first year of Cyrus, as you'll see in Ezra. Okay? That's when Daniel prays, at the beginning of the 49th year that Israel has been, that the temple has been down. Now, at this point, he's going to get into a very complicated thing where every time he sevens, he makes a 7th paragraph. See, this is the sevening at 49. His next sevening is at 182. Let me see if I can get rid of the black. Is at 182. The difference between them is 133, and that's a very specific syllable in Isaiah 53 that ties to Manasseh. Manasseh is fall in the Isaiah chronology. Manasseh's fall and capture. I think it's by the Assyrians. Manasseh has a change of heart while he's captured. But he's captured first. And syllable 133 in Isaiah prophetically, annotated that in the meter. Alright? Daniel knows that meter. Daniel's tying to it here. So he's got 2 time tracks. The second time track is again starting from the same current point when he prays. But at syllable 133, he basically uses that as an excuse to jump backwards 133 years in time. Whereas when he's doing the straightforward chronology here, Moses had his straightforward chronology too, so did Isaiah. In his straightforward chronology, after he's done his first date line saying, "Hi, I'm 49 years from the temple," and his second date line, which is in Daniel 9:5, saying, "I'm 73 sevens from 1050 BC," where Moses left off, when Moses ended his Psalm 90, 1400 minus 350, 1050 BC when Saul was chosen over God. David picks up his chronology showing that all the kings sinned. David, of course, being recorded what his sins were. But it's not just David, and David, of course, believed in God in spite of the fact that he kept sinning. And the rest of the nation, some of them believed and some of them didn't. But David had 40 years reigning at Hebron, so that's metered by Daniel, talking off the top of his head as far as I know, at 40 syllables representing 40 years. So the cumulative syllable counts are taking you down in time. And you'll notice this starts with a 49 and this ends with a 49. Okay? He's ending the 49 to Manasseh, because Manasseh was age 49 when this happened. It's really awesome how he does this. And then in his second time track, he's gotten full circle back to 538 BC when he prays. He started going back in time, and he's full circle back to when he prays. See, he starts with Manasseh, and he comes back to his own time, because in his time track here, he's at Manasseh. See, these people were really smart. He's talking off the top of his head to God. As far as I know, he didn't compose this in advance. All right? And so he's bookending 49, 49 to show that full circle. This is how you could understand it if you were, reading Daniel in Hebrew. You would notice that because you memorized Bible text by the syllable counts. Okay? So then he begins a new paragraph, which is 42 and 42. 42 meaning the number 35 plus 7, we just saw that in Mary. 35 is God's vote. Plus 7 means at least one generation is responding, usually in times of trouble, because 7 is a tribulational number. All right. So 42 means that there is a response in troubled times, which there was. In time track 1, it's the rest of Manasseh. And Manasseh repented, but Israel didn't. So Daniel has to keep on going with the time track. And then, of course, that's why Nebuchadnezzar came. That's on this first time track, which is just going chronologically year by year. All right, and this takes you to Nebuchadnezzar. And now he's full circle with respect to time track 1 as to where he is in history. Okay? On time track 2, you're going to have to spend time looking at this. I can't go through it in detail. You're going to have to just read it if you want to. In time track 2, he's full circle already, and now he's tracking to a later place in both Isaiah and Psalm 90, just before the end of the voting period, because now he's talking forward of his own time, say 538 to 496 BC. Because he's now, at this point, he's beginning to invoke, he's sort of summarizing it, because now he's still in current time track here. Here he's already future. And he's beginning to, 914 is a benchmark between the end of the indictment of Israel and 915, which begins his petition about restoring time. So what he's doing with the 42 paragraphs, see it's bookended here and here, he's asking for the regeneration. That's what 42 means doctrinally. He's asking for the regeneration of time. And at that point, 126 years are still owed on the first temple because it went down early. That's why God replies in Daniel 9:25 with a unit of 7 weeks, okay, and 62 weeks. 62 weeks consists of the 364 years the temple had been standing, so that's going to be reimbursed, plus 70 because by the end of the 70 that they're going through now, if the temple's, rebuilt, then God can justify reimbursing the first 70 years. That's something the scholars don't understand. All right, but they would understand it if they understood this meter, because Daniel's using his own, he's now in his own 70th year of captivity. He's using that as a pun. Look, I'm in my 70th year, so I'm praying for the restoration of 70 years, to be regenerated. That's what 42 means. It's really clever. And that's what this period stands for. Okay? That would kick the ball off so that the 70 could be refunded. All right? It's very complicated, as you can see. All right. But I'm going to skip over that down to this. Well, wait a minute. I got to go back up here. At the 49, when he closed the 49, his total cumulative syllable count was 434. Again, That's represented by 364 years the temple was standing, plus at this point he's getting ready to petition for the refund of the 70 years that Israel's out from 586 to 516 BC. That's why that's 434 syllables. Now think. The total time grant unit is 490 years. You've seen that several times now. 490 minus 434 is 56. This is where Mary's playing on it. Okay? That's why she's ending here with a 56. 40 years for Christ's allotment and 16 years after that in order to tie to Daniel. The Abrahamic refund of 40 years is already included in that. But there's this question of the 62nd week. Mary is invoking the 62nd week of Daniel 9:25, and that 62nd week of Daniel 9:25 is caused by God replying to Daniel's request for it, especially beginning here, because he's setting it up, 434. We spent the last 400, these are literal years, okay? We spent the last 434 years screwing up, so we need you to reimburse time. You know, just like he ends his prayer in verse 19, which is what Mary plays on. Because we're sinners, we need more time. And in order to make sure that anybody understanding this prayer gets that point, first he words the text that way, and he ends his prayer at 742 syllables. 742 is 56 shy of 700 and, well, it's technically 8 shy of 750. But you got to understand, he's accounting now in sevens. 757 equals 5,250 years, which was the total allotment of time that you saw if you understood Psalm 90. Psalm 90 was 5 70s, 14 syllables of which were housed up in the millennial section of Psalm 90 verses 1 through 4, and debited from the very period Daniel's praying about. Okay, that left 56. So 757 equals 8 sevens are missing from the total in his prayer, meaning 56 years are in ellipsis for God to grant. That's the same thing as saying 62 weeks, because there should have been 70 weeks, because that's 490, which you see explicitly in the text of Daniel 9, but nobody knows where it comes from because they don't know this meter. 62 weeks is 434. That was after 7 weeks, which was 49. See? 49. The reimbursement of the 49 years that missed sabbatical years are being reimbursed. This is how I learned this whole structure. So when I looked at Daniel 9:25, I realized God was reimbursing something. Okay? And he's reimbursing the missed sabbatical years if the temple gets completed by the 70-year period. And that reimbursement follows after 2 70s, because Daniel's asking for it to be reimbursed right here, which he goes on to do right here. See, there's a 14 that's missing. See, 476 is 14 missing from 490, because that part of it can't be reimbursed. Christ has to come first for that part, that 14 to play. See, that's what Mary's playing on. When she's talking down here, she's got 16, but that encapsulates the 14, which is 40 plus 14 reimbursing Abraham. And at the same time, that 14 missing in history, which is reserved ever since Psalm 90, verses 1 through 4. See how complicated this is? Because God's balancing time. And that she learned also from Daniel doing it here and doing it here. See, doing it at 9:14 is 476. That's the 14 debit. 62 weeks, the sum of that's 434 years, and that's right here in Daniel 9:13. The cumulative total syllable count. See how easy, if you grew up learning these syllable counts. The minute you heard these numbers and then you saw the text saying 490 and 62 weeks, you know exactly where it comes from. But of course, if you're learning it in translation, it's coming to you out of the blue. You have no idea. And of course, when you got down here at 742, because you're so used to counting syllables, you know, oh, that's 8/7 shy of 750, which is 8/7 shy of the total plan of history in Moses, because Moses is using 570s, which stand for 5, 10, 50 units of time. See? Including the Millennium. All right. Hopefully you got that, because I got to move on. Daniel's ending syllable, therefore, is 47. And that's what Mary's playing on also when she does this business about 40 years, Christ dying when he's 40. Okay? That was here at this point in the text. And then there's 14 more years. The pregnant 14 has to be paid to the Gentiles to reimburse for Abraham maturing too early. Okay? But, remember, 7 of those years are tribulation. There was another 7, and that's part of the 62 weeks. Part of the 7, one of the 7s, was owed on this 49 here. See, 49 sabbatical years had to elapse. Okay, but there are another 7 sabbatical years due on them. But they can't play. Israel's already out of time. That's why Daniel's debiting 14 there. Just like Isaiah debited 28, meaning 14 negative have to be paid with 14 positive. But there's no time left. So one of the 7s has to occur after Messiah is born and be in where? The 62nd week, because there's only one 7 after that left. So the 7 years missing on these 49, the missed sabbatical years. The missed sabbatical years, okay, this is the time. Time is up. They got to return to the land now, because the sabbatical years are going to be up. He's praying at the beginning of the 49th year. Okay, but what about the 7 extra sabbatical years that accrued during the 49 missed sabbatical years, where Israel got its Sabbaths for the past? But there's 7 new years that are owing on it now. What about that? Well, that's going to have to be housed in the 62nd week. So that's why Messiah living till 40, if Messiah lives until 40, okay, then if he doesn't die until he's 40, then those extra 7 years are going to be paid essentially by allowing him, by his own lifetime. You know, he's going to have to be sinless, he's going to have to succeed, you know, all those conditions. All right? But if he successfully lives for 40 years, then that first 7 that got missed down here, all right, the 49 missed sabbatical years down here are basically encoded in his life up there. All right? Of course, we know that he died 7 years early, which is why the temple goes down, 64 to 70 AD in the old accounting, or 66 to 73 AD if you want to use, you know, different accounting, depending on what you want to call the BC AD years. Okay? So Daniel has already accounted the shortfall, and he's referencing the 56, which is the sum of, okay, 54 plus 3.5, 56 being, you know, truncated, so it's divisible by 7, but it has the same meaning. It's measuring between the two dates at 56. You're counting one of them if you say 57. All right? So he's counting, he's debiting 56 between the two dates here. God responds with a 56. Okay, that's the 62 weeks. And it's debited, oops, I shouldn't have done that. It's debited here by Daniel because he knows that those extra 14 years can't play. All right? So, in the next increment, we have to get into the next thing that Mary's doing to show the tie to Abraham, because I've explained that that's what's happening, but I haven't shown you how this 47 that Daniel's using right here, my computer's hanging up too, the 47 down here in the lower left-hand corner, Mary is playing on that symbolically by means of syllable count. She's playing on it symbolically here. Okay, 40 standing for a year of judgment, 7 standing for, a warning period, 7 standing for tribulation, and of course at that time, ending in 122 BC in her chronology, that's exactly what was happening to Israel. So this is symbolically characteristic of the time. And she's playing and tagging Daniel's syllable 47 there. Because what was everybody saying at this time in history? Oh, Dad, please deliver us, just like Daniel is saying in Daniel 9:19.